Yeah, thank you very much for having me here today. Really chuffed to be able to have the opportunity to talk to so many people about dormice. For a little bit of background on me, my name is Sam. I'm chair of Shropshire Dormouse Group. I'm an ecologist and I'm also a self-professed mammal detective. So what that means essentially is I like to go around sniffing the air for signs of fox and getting close to mammal poo. So that's what I do for a living. But you're here to hear about dormice. So what is a dormouse? So they're a small mammal. They're not a mouse. There is a dormouse family. So they're in their own family, Glirida. And there are only native species of dormice in the UK. So we do have another species of dormice in the UK, the edible dormouse, but it is non-native. So these little critters are the only ones that are native. They're quite small, so they're about 5 centimetres from head to bum, and that's not including the tail. Normally they have a quite long furry tail. Now the dormouse that you can see in the picture in front of you actually has half a tail. This dormouse was affectionately known as Stumpy. He was found on one of the reserves that we monitor a few years ago, and we saw him pop up in nest boxes again year on year for a while. He hasn't shown up for a couple of years now, but normally they would have a much longer tail than this little guy. They are this sort of sandy colour, so when they're younger they're a little bit grayer. As they get older they go a bit more golden, gingery, and there's some other really key features that they have. So they have these really large black eyes, and that's because they are a nocturnal species. So you're very unlikely to see them out in the day. It doesn't mean they don't come out in the day, you're just less likely to. And they also have these adorable little feet. So they have double jointed hind ankles, and they have some really unique padding on their feet. So they're very sticky. And I can attest to their stickiness, having had one climb all the way up my arm and end up on my head, I think twice now. They seem to be able to climb up plastic bags really easily. But they have this adaptation with their feet because they're an arboreal species. And what that means is they live in the trees. So they're adapted to live up in sort of the trees, and they're really good climbers. And this leads me on to where they live. So as you can imagine, with adaptations for living in trees, they are adapted to live in woodlands. And in particular, they're closely connected with woodland that has a variety of sort of age structure within it. So biodiverse woodlands that have a whole mosaic of different structures in the woodland are best for dormice. And what that means is within a woodland, you'd have an area that's perhaps completely cleared of trees and has just got bramble and other scrubby species. It might be quite dense, and that can provide some really good nesting space for dormice. It can also provide some really sort of well hidden places for them to kind of move around without getting seen by predators. And then you'd also have some areas that have some young understory tree species. So that would be species like hazel, elder, hawthorn, trees that don't grow very high, that tend to have a sort of spreading growth to them. And then within that woodland, you'd also have some high canopy as well. So that includes oak, sycamore, beech, all these sorts of big trees that we see in woodland. So for dormice in particular, it's not just woodland that is high forest. They do need this kind of diverse structure, and we'll look into why in a second. And one of the most important things for them is aerial connectivity. So you can see in the photo on the left, we've got this big wide footpath and we've got these lovely wildflower verges. And dormice, it's not that they'll never come to the ground. There are studies that show that they'll come to the ground if they have to, but they much prefer to cross open spaces high up in the trees. So there's actually a study that would show that they travel sort of 50 meters down a tree line to find a space to cross rather than come to the ground. So you can see in this photo on the left, even though it's got this big wide footpath, there is aerial connectivity between the two sides of the woodland, and that is really important for them. And we can see on this screenshot, this is somewhere in South Shropshire. As much as is possible in sort of modern Britain, this is kind of ideal for dormice. So hopefully you can see my cursor. We have some really big patches of woodland. We've got this long strip here. We've got a big woodland here. Got loads and loads of woodland, all quite close together. And we've got connectivity. So between woodlands, you can see in particular down here, there's some hedgerows that are connecting the two bits of woodland. And they're quite dense. There's some little woodland copses here as well. And even if we look up to the northwest over here along the road, you can see that there's quite a lot of trees here either side of the road, so they have the capability of crossing over without coming down to the ground and without being at risk of being hit by traffic. So this is a sort of ideal landscape for dormice as much as is possible in modern times. What do they eat? So they'll eat a whole range of things, most things to be honest. They lack a cecum, and that's a part of their digestive system that digests fibre. So they won't eat leaves or grass. But what they do eat, they can eat, as can be seen in the pictures here, blackberries, hazelnuts, other fruits and nuts, other seeds. They'll eat nectar, pollen, invertebrates. They might even eat eggs if they can get their hands on them. So they'll eat a wide range of things. But the really important thing to note is that they are what's known as sequential feeders. And what that means is that they eat a variety of different foods throughout the year, depending on the season. So they come out of hibernation in spring, and there's not much food available immediately, but there are some sort of spring flowers, such as on hawthorn and blackthorn, and that means they'll be able to have some nectar and pollen from those species. And then as spring goes on, there'll be more flowers and more nectar and pollen that they can consume. In summer, there's not that many, we're not yet sort of at the point where there's lots of fruits and seeds for them, and we're kind of just out of flowering season. So in summer, they heavily depend on invertebrates. And these are associated with the canopy trees, the oak, the sycamore, the beech. So you can start to see how the different parts of woodland provide that different variety of food that they need. And then as we go into autumn, that's when they'll be fattening up on high calorie foods like the blackberries, the hazelnuts. And this will be to put on a lot of weight so that they can go into hibernation. And you can see from this particularly sort of chubby dormice just how fat they can get just before hibernation. It is really important for them to put on a lot of weight at that point. So let's talk a little bit about breeding. So dormice will have, typically speaking, 1 to 2 litters a year. So they're not like mouse species that will breed very, very often. And they also have fairly small litters. They have about 4 or 5 young, which mostly always will survive at least up until hibernation. And again, not like mouse species where they'll have massive litters because predation rate is really high. So they don't have a really sort of high breeding rate. And therefore there are low densities of dormice even where they are present in woodlands. So on the left you can see that these are pinks, or they're just getting a little bit grey. The names we give them are self-explanatory. So pinks are pink. They're little tiny jelly beans, completely dependent on mum, just a few days old. And then on the right we have grey's eyes closed, again quite self-explanatory. They've got this grey colour to their fur. Their eyes are closed, again dependent on mum, and that will be within sort of the week and a half stage. And then we have grey's eyes open on the left, and again, as the name suggests, they've still got that grey colouring. Their eyes are open at this point, and this is a really, really energetic stage. So at this point, when they're not 100% just lying in the nest all the time, they've got so much energy. They popcorn about. When we have found grey's eyes open on nest box checks and we're monitoring them, they just bounce all over the place in the bags. They seem to have so much energy. They've got these massive feet, because their feet seem bigger in proportion to the rest of their body. And then on the right we have juveniles. So at about 28 days they can be independent of mum. Sometimes they might stay with mum for a little bit longer. So I've mentioned they have 1 to 2 litters a year. So if they have a litter in spring, they might get the babies might get kicked out sooner so that mum can have another litter. If they have a late litter in autumn, it might be that they stay with mum until they're ready to go into hibernation. So they might be fattening out. They might be going in and out of the same nest that they were born into. Normally, records show that in the south of the country, where it's a little bit warmer, that's where dormice are more likely to have the 2 litters a year. And in Shropshire, for Shropshire Dormouse Group, throughout our 5 years of recording, we've only ever recorded the late litter, the one sort of end of summer. However, this year we had something really, really exciting. So this is one of our committee members, Steph, she's all kitted out in terms of PTS protocol for coronavirus, preventing transmission between mammals and each other. And what was very, very exciting was that she found, her and Katie, another committee member, found on one of our sites juveniles in June. So that means there was a litter, an early litter in May, and we've said in the 5 years that we've been recording, we've never found that. Now, that doesn't mean that there hasn't been early litters in Shropshire. It could well be that they have early litters elsewhere, higher up in the trees, lower down, just not in our nest boxes. But this is really exciting for us. And this is complete and utter speculation, but this could be at least a positive impact of climate change. So climate change is a big factor in the decline of hibernating species. And that's because it's causing milder winters. So they're warmer. This means hibernating animals come out of hibernation more regularly. And this can mean that they don't survive hibernation because they don't have enough energy to keep going in and out of hibernation. So that's a really sort of big impact. However, it's a total speculation, but could it be that this is a positive impact of climate change, at least in the northern counties within their range, that they're able to have an earlier litter because there's more food available for them early on, so they can get into peak breeding condition. We don't know, maybe there's a dissertation project there for someone. And this here is just one of the juveniles that was found, so absolutely adorable, and there's lots more adorable photos to come to show you. They are a really, really cute species. So let's talk about breeding nests. So dormice will make a few different nests. They can make resting nests. These are maybe just little scruffy nests that they rest in for the day. They don't always make them to rest in. They might rest behind a little bit of ivy on a tree. They might also make hibernation nests occasionally. Again, they're just sort of a scruffy nest. But breeding nests are what we're looking for. So we hope that dormice will make nests in our nest boxes. And a typical breeding nest for dormice is on the left in that blurry photo. You can see that's the inner structure of a dormice nest. So typically it's stripped pieces of bark, usually honeysuckle, and they weave it all together and they make this absolutely incredible ball structure. It's really dense, it's really sort of thick, and it's got a hole in the middle. Usually that lines up with a hole on the nest box. Often if mum is in there with babies, she will kind of cover that hole over so there's no obvious entrance hole. So this is the inner structure. And then what they'll usually do, and you can see it on the right, is they'll insulate that with green leaves. And what I mean when I say green leaves is they'll take them fresh from the tree. So some mouse species will take brown leaves from the floor, so dead leaves, and make a nest of that. Some of them will also take green leaves, which complicates the issue when we're looking at nests a little bit. But dormice will take the leaves fresh off the tree. And sometimes we'll see one part of the nest without the other. So sometimes we'll see the inner structure on its own. Sometimes we'll just see a nest of green leaves. One of the most beautiful dormice nests I've ever seen was it was in a nest box on a beech tree. And they'd made this beautiful maternity nest, absolutely filled the box, and it was entirely beech leaves. And yet it was still woven. Somehow, they hadn't stripped the leaves, but somehow they'd made this beautiful structure that was just woven entirely from beech leaves. It was gorgeous. And then there are other nests. So Shropshire Dormice don't read the books. These two nests are on one reserve that we monitor. So on the left, you can see this nest is made entirely from grass. That's very, very unusual. You can also see it barely fills the box. It's a very, very small nest. But this nest did have a mum and young dormice in, so this was a maternity nest. And on the right, it's a nest made entirely from bracken. I would have loved to have seen footage of the dormice dragging bracken leaves into that box to try and make that nest. Yeah, absolutely amazing. And then the last couple of years on a different reserve, we found dormice in nests made entirely from brown leaves. So I've just told you that dormice make nests from green leaves, not brown. However, on this one site in Shropshire, they do seem to like to make them out of brown leaves, and we don't know if that's they've entered a nest that belonged to a mouse before, and they've kind of you know, woven the leaves together to make a structure, or whether they've actually made it from brown leaves themselves. We don't know. But yeah, so they don't read the books. And what we do know is this isn't for lack of other nesting materials. So on both these sites, they've got plenty of honeysuckle that they can strip. They've got plenty of green leaves. So we don't know why this has happened. Again, another dissertation project for someone, I'm sure. But it's absolutely fascinating. They're very adaptable creatures, as they don't read the books at all. So I've mentioned hibernation. So dormice are a hibernating animal, and they will generally go into hibernation from about November, December, maybe a bit earlier or later, and they'll start to come out between in March and April. They'll start to come in and out of hibernation, test the waters. This can change depending on the particular sort of climate at the time, any other factors as well. And as I mentioned, climate change can impact them in terms of bringing them in and out of hibernation. It's worth mentioning that between 40 to 70% of dormice die in hibernation. That is part of their natural ecology. So that is kind of part of what's natural for them. However, obviously climate change will be impacting that. So there will be potentially more dormice dying, a greater percentage of dormice dying during hibernation. I've said that they don't like to come to the ground. However, although there isn't masses known about the hibernation of dormice, they will come to the ground to hibernate. So they may hibernate in leaf litter, in log piles, in old mouse burrows, in coppice stools. Basically, they'll choose somewhere where the temperature doesn't fluctuate, or is less likely to fluctuate, so there's less chance of them being brought in and out of hibernation, and somewhere a little bit damp so they don't desiccate. So and they will choose unusual places as well. Again, this is Shropshire Dormice. Last year, I think it was, had someone get in touch because he found a dormice trying to hibernate in his garden scrap, and this is scrap metal, so don't know what they're doing. And then they've also got this state called torpor. So most dormice, you'll see the iconic kind of picture of the dormice curled up, like the picture on the right. They're in this state called torpor. And that's like a mini hibernation. So it's less than 24 hours, and it's in response to inclement weather. So if there's particularly poor weather, maybe it's a bit cold, maybe it's a bit wet, they don't like foraging when it's wet, they'll go into this state called torpor, and it conserves energy. So it might well be, you know, there's been bad weather, they haven't been able to get any food. It makes sense to kind of conserve energy. And so they go into this state. And it can take them sort of 20 to 30 minutes to come out of that when disturbed. So although it has its benefits, it can also leave them vulnerable to predation as well. A lot of the dormice that we find in nest boxes are in torpor, and they're absolutely adorable. They stretch, and they're very, very cute. Okay. So I need to tell you a little bit about dormice in the law because it is incredibly important. They are an endangered species. They are a European protected species, and they are protected by about 4 pieces of UK legislation as well. So what this all means is every individual dormouse, every dormouse nest, and all of their resting places are protected by law from disturbance. So it's completely illegal to disturb them or to destroy a nest or any resting place. And if you are to disturb dormice, you need a license. But why would you want to disturb them? So I've mentioned nest boxes a lot. I've mentioned monitoring. One of the main reasons that we need licenses and why we would want to disturb dormice are to contribute data to a national scheme. So the People's Trust for Endangered Species, they set up about 30 years ago the National Dormice Monitoring Programme. Basically says what it does on the tin really. And it was a scheme to set up to monitor dormice across the country. Essentially what this is we put up ideally 50 or more nest boxes on a site. They are a bit like, well, they are like a bird box, but they've got the hole in the back instead of the front, because dormice will be climbing on the trees. However, we will find birds in them in spring, and on sites for dormice that monitor for birds, we find dormice in the bird boxes as well. So they don't really seem to care all that much about where the hole in the box is. But it mimics a sort of tree cavity or a safe space for them to nest in. So it mimics that, and then they're drawn to it and they'll make their nest in there. And that means we can check them. So what we'll then go and do is we'll check these. This can be minimum twice a year. So at the very minimum, you need data from pre-breeding and post-breeding. But you can check them once a month in their active season. So we like to do this. This contributes more data to the scheme, and it enables us to offer more training opportunities. So to have a license to disturb dormice, you need to undergo a lot of training. So we can offer those opportunities. And if we find any mammals in the boxes, what we do is we collect the biometric data. So what that means is that's data such as their weight, their sex, their age class. It can mean a breeding condition as well. So do we have a post-lactating female? Do we have a male in peak breeding condition? That kind of thing. And we record this for all mammals that we find, not just dormice. So the other data on other mammals is held in a database, and it can be used in the future as well. So this data all contributes to the National Dormice Monitoring Programme, and that's been really, really important. It's been going for, like I said, about 30 years, and this graph was produced by the People's Trust for Endangered Species. I believe it was in the State of Britain's Dormice Report 2018, and it shows a decline in dormice. In fact, we know that dormice have declined by 50% since the year 2000, which is absolutely devastating. If we weren't to monitor dormice, we wouldn't know this. As mentioned, they're nocturnal, they're arboreal, and they live in low population density, so they're very, very hard to find. They're not a creature that you're really just going to encounter when you're just wandering around a woodland, or you'd be very, very lucky if you did. And so this scheme and being able to monitor them has been absolutely crucial for telling us just how severely they've declined. Furthermore, not only do we know they've declined in numbers, but their geographical range has shrunk as well. So they used to be fairly widespread across most of England and Wales, not present in Scotland. However, since 1885, they've become extinct in, I think, 17 counties. So they're now only present in 32 counties. That's not including reintroductions. So the map on the right has got some red dots where there's been reintroductions, or that was up until 2013 anyway. And reintroductions of dormice in counties where they haven't been present for a while have had varying success. If you go on the People's Trust for Endangered Species website, they have a comprehensive report on all the reintroductions. That's fascinating. It's a really good read. But we can see that the geographical range has reduced massively, and mostly it's kind of restricted to the southern part of the country and the Midlands. And we can see that actually Shropshire is towards the northern part of their range as well. But even within Shropshire, there's been changes. So the yellow dots are kind of ancient records of dormice, or old records of dormice, and the red are more recent records. So it seems that dormice have, as far as we can tell, pretty much disappeared from North Shropshire. We don't know why this is. Again, probably a dissertation project there for someone if you're interested. But it's really, really important, and it goes to show how important Shropshire is in terms of dormice, monitoring really, and contributing that data so we can build up a big picture of the whole country of what's going on with dormice. So why are dormice in decline? So I've talked about the habitat that they require, which provides them with kind of optimum feeding opportunities. It also provides them with sort of travelling opportunities, nesting space as well. And they They've adapted to, well, they've evolved alongside other animals that created this landscape. So in ancient Britain, we had megafauna, and their grazing patterns created this mosaic of woodland habitats. Britain used to be a lot more forested than it is now. I think estimates are between 70 and 95%, whereas now I believe it's about 7 to 11%. So not only have we lost a lot of woodland, which of course is going to be a factor in the decline of dormice, but there's also been a change in kind of how woodlands are. So megafauna became extinct. Humans sort of then took on, they almost replicated the role of megafauna. So for a while, humans coppiced woodland. And what that means, you can see in this photo, there's hazel coppice. So when a tree grows initially, it'll have a single stem, but trees in Britain have become adapted to the megafauna that used to exist. So that if they get chewed or knocked down, they will then regrow with lots more, lots more branches. Can't think of the word, stems, and that'll happen again and again. So the more that they're chewed, the more that they're sort of damaged, they'll kind of send up loads more shoots. So obviously this pattern means that occasionally there's areas that are bare, so bramble can take over, but it also means there's a lot more food produced. So if you can imagine a hazel tree like this will produce so many more hazelnuts in its sort of fruiting years than a single stem hazel would. So this has not only been beneficial, obviously, to dormice, but to most wildlife. It just provides so much more food for wildlife. Like I said, humans used to coppice woodland to get the products. However, coppice products became obsolete. So we used to use them for things like as hedge stakes and hurdles, that kind of thing. And we don't really do that anymore. So this practice became neglected. And what that meant is woodlands were neglected, and there was no longer this kind of activity that created this mosaic of woodland habitat. And instead, woodland that's neglected will then grow into high forest. So lots and lots of tall canopy trees, they overshadow everything else. You have a really dark understory. That means there's nothing else. You won't get bramble, you won't get many understory species. And as we talked about with food, that doesn't really provide for dormice. That's not to say they won't be present in woodland that is entirely high forest or even in conifer plantations. Dormice seem to be very adaptable in that they can exist, and sometimes in great quantities on what we would call suboptimal woodlands. But we don't know whether that is because they're just holding on. It doesn't mean that suboptimal habitat is actually supporting them. Maybe they're just holding on in that area and they're on the brink of dying out in that area. So this is really what they need. And because there's been a lack of kind of the management of woodlands to kind of create this, that is a really, really big factor that's caused a decline of dormice. So now most woodlands that are managed in this way are only done so intentionally by conservation organisations for wildlife. So woodlands that might not have say a purpose to a landowner, it might just get left and not managed. So this is really, really important for dormice. But furthermore, you can see that this satellite view of a part of Shropshire is very, very different to the one I showed earlier. So this is more typical of the country. You can see, if I can get my cursor up, you can see that there's really big fields. So intensification of farming practices has had a massive impact on dormice as well. There's massive fields, and this is because hedgerows became ripped out. And the hedgerows that do exist, you can kind of see from the satellite view, they're not really very well connected. There's a little strip here, for example, and then a standalone tree. It doesn't look anything like the previous image. And you can see there's these little woodlands, very small pockets of woodland. So a dormice home range is about 1 hectare. They need quite a lot of space, and they need, particularly if it's suboptimal woodland, they'll need more woodland to meet their feeding needs. You can see even with these two bits of woodland here, there's not really very good connectivity between them. And so in autumn, when juveniles disperse away from their mum and they go and find somewhere to hibernate, they'll be dispersing into habitat that is unclaimed. And so if they can't get out of a woodland, if there's no links out of the woodland and they can't find habitat that they can have that provides enough feeding for them, then of course they're not going to survive. So this can mean that small woodlands that are isolated can become population sinks. Maybe they're just big enough to sustain a population, but you know, they can't kind of boost the populations nearby. And furthermore, if you had 2 different dormice populations, say, in each of these woodlands, and they couldn't travel between the 2, this would also mean that within each woodland there would be inbreeding. So they're not able to disperse between the 2 to breed, and then you'll get inbreeding within that woodland. That can decrease genetic diversity, and then that can lead to local extinctions. So sort of destruction of hedgerows has been a really critical factor as well in leading to the decline of dormice. Hedgerows in themselves, if managed appropriately, can also provide really, really good habitat for dormice, even to breed in. Often though, hedgerows are either sort of flailed within an inch of their life and flailed too often, so they don't have time to provide food, or they can become neglected. So a hedgerow that's neglected, that isn't managed appropriately, will grow into just lots of standard trees. And that might provide routes for dormice to travel between areas, but it's not really going to be able to provide habitat in itself to support a breeding population. That's all a bit doom and gloom. So let's talk a little bit about Shropshire Dormouse Group. Who are we? What do we do? So we began, I said, about 5 years ago. There was just a handful of us, and it was in response to the Shropshire Wildlife Trust asking some of us to see if we could rekindle monitoring on some of their reserves. So I think it was 2 reserves in particular. They had dormice nest boxes on. People had been monitoring them in the past, but there wasn't any sort of regular monitoring continued, and the nest boxes were kind of fallen into disrepair. So we took that on, we repaired or replaced nest boxes, we added a few new ones to try and make it up to 50, and we began monitoring. And we loved it so much that we've just been doing that since. So now we monitor between us approximately 9 or 10 sites. Pandemic aside, we do that every month in their active season, so sort of April to October. So that's a lot of monitoring going on, and of course that data feeds into the National Dormice Monitoring Programme, and it helps to build a picture up of what's going on in Shropshire as well. That data will go to local landowners as well, so our sites are mostly Shropshire Wildlife Trust and Shropshire Council. There's also some sites that are owned by private landowners as well. But that data can then go to the landowner, and they can have an idea of how their dormouse populations are doing, are they breeding, and then we can go from there and kind of think a little bit more about what happens next. So another thing to mention really that we do, there's only so many of us, and as I mentioned, you need a license to monitor dormice, and that can take a lot of training. There's only a handful of us that are licensed, so there's not enough of us or enough money for nest boxes and everything to be able to cover as many sites as we would like. So in between that, there are also other dormice survey methods we can carry out that don't need a license and that we can train people to do. And one of those is nibbled nut surveys. Dormice eat hazelnuts in a very, very distinctive way, and it's easily identifiable. So we can go out, we can wander around a woodland, we can just do it once in autumn, look for some hazelnuts, and if we find one that's been eaten by a dormice, we can say, great, we've got a record for dormice here. And in the absence of being able to monitor them, at least it means we might have a recent record, and we can add this to a database we're working on to come back in the future and try and put up a nest box scheme. And we can also do habitat assessments as well. So we might go out to a site and say, okay, we know there's a woodland in this area. What's it like? Is it any good for dormice? Is it well connected to the surrounding landscape? That sort of thing. So we can do that while not having the capacity to monitor every site that we would like to. But what's important to mention as well is that it's all well and good monitoring species, and it's all well and good seeing them decline. But is there much point to that if you're just going to let them decline? So what we want to do, one of our biggest aims going forward, is to try and help prevent that decline, at least where we can, potentially reverse it. So I've talked about the fact that a change in the way we manage woodlands is one of the biggest drivers of decline. So what we're doing now is we're building up a really good habitat management team to go out on reserves and manage habitat in ways that will benefit dormice. That can look quite messy initially, and for most people they might see trees being cut down, and it doesn't look good to most people. But as I've talked about, that is absolutely crucial to the survival of dormice, so we do need to go in and do that. For most sites that we monitor, as I mentioned, they're owned by organisations or like the Wildlife Trust Council. They'll generally have habitat management plans for a site. And what that means is they've taken into account all the species that live on that site and what would benefit them. But as you can imagine, usually there's a lack of funding and staff time even to be able to carry out everything. So for example, with the Wildlife Trust, they have over 50 nature reserves, a very small reserves team. Every year they look at the things that need doing on their reserves. And what we're doing now is we're helping to kind of supplement that. So we liaise with landowners and we'll say, what is your plan? What's in your plan for dormice? What can we do? What can we take on to help? So for example, we've spent some time clearing tall standard kind of high forest in areas as well, just little areas to open up the canopy. We've helped to do up hedgerows as well. So there's been hedgerows that have become a little bit defunct, which means over time they've just been allowed to grow up and they become gappy. So we go in and we lay stems and we encourage new growth as well, which is really good for dormice to nest in and to disperse through. And this is a really big part of what we want to do going forward. So we're really hoping to kind of build on that and do a lot more of that. And what else do we do? So we offer a lot of training opportunities, or at least we were able to pre-pandemic. To get a dormice license, it can take a couple of years of coming out on site and handling dormice. You need to be competent at handling dormice in all life stages. As I mentioned, for example, Grey's eyes open are very energetic, very hard to handle. So you need to prove your competency in handling and identifying. But also you need to attend theory sessions. So something that we're doing as well is delivering theory sessions. When you apply for a dormice license, you need to show that you've attended one of these. So this means offering this locally means that we can kind of help people in Shropshire to get licensed quicker potentially. Otherwise, you might have to travel to places like the Isle of Wight or London for a course like this. And we also like to deliver talks, not just training, but talks like the one I'm doing today, just to raise awareness really. So pre-pandemic, we'd go and do talks to the local Wildlife Trust branch, that kind of thing, just to raise awareness to people about dormice and that they're in the area and try and sort of gather interest really. Other things that we've done, for example, are we've held workshops where we've helped people to build nest boxes for dormice. So this is helpful because it's then created boxes that we can put up on a site, so that's low cost. It also means people then know how to build nest boxes so they could build them if they've got sort of a private woodland, that kind of thing. And we'll try and give advice to landowners as well. So there's only so many of us and we don't have masses of capacity. And we get a lot of people get in touch and say, I've seen a dormice in my garden, I found a dormice nest, I think I've got a dormice nippled nut. And we just don't currently have the capacity to go out and visit every single one of those, as much as we'd like to, and as much as we'd like to get nest boxes out on all of those sites. But what we can do is offer advice. So through email or with a phone call, we can chat to landowners, we can confirm or otherwise the sign they found, whether it is dormice, make that record. And going from there, then we can sort of say, okay, well, maybe could you think about doing this kind of management for them? We could say, oh, you've got a really nice hedgerow, would you consider managing that kind of thing. So we can offer support in that way as well. So this year, well, obviously it's not been off to the best start, but we have been lucky enough to be awarded some money through the People's Postcode Lottery, and that's as part of the Stepping Stones project. Which is the Longmynd and Cyperstones sort of area of Shropshire. So through that, what we are hoping to do, and hopefully we can get things sort of kick-started again soon, as I mentioned, habitat management is a really big thing that we want to focus on going forward. So we're hoping to be able to use that money to buy lots of new tools and have somewhere to store them, and you know, buy trees to plant, that kind of thing. And also we want to try and expand our site. So we have a handful of people, handful of our volunteers are very nearly licensed, and they just need to handle a few more dormice. The map on the right is a slightly older map. I think doesn't include all our sites, but we'd like to have more sites. So hopefully the money that we get through that award will pay for more nest boxes, as well as help us deliver more training and more theory training, book hauls, that kind of thing, so that we can get more licensed monitors. So that is the plan. We like to offer opportunities for the public to engage as well. So not only do we offer training opportunities, but obviously not everyone wants to train but wants to come out and learn about dormice. So something we do like to do, if we can do, is do a public nest box check at least once a year. So that gives people the opportunity to come along and potentially see dormice or learn about what we do. Also, like I said, talks and things for the general public, not just training. So we do like to do that as well. Hopefully through the Stepping Stones project, we'll be able to deliver some of that this year. We did have plans to do a couple of open nest box checks, some habitat management days, and also some nibbled nut hunt days as well, to train people to identify hazelnuts. Have to see what happens over the next few weeks maybe to see whether we can still deliver that. So if you've been inspired to get involved with us, you can email us. Our email address is there, shropshiredormouse@gmail.com. We have 3 mailing lists. So we've got a general mailing list. We don't send a lot out through that one, but you'll get informed of events and public nest box checks, that kind of thing. We've got a trainee surveyors mailing list. So if you want to train for your license to handle dormice and to monitor them, we can add you to that. And we've got a habitat management crew mailing list as well. So if you'd like to be added to any of them, you can send us an email and ask to be added. You can also use that email address if you're a landowner, you've got some woodland, you want to know if you've got dormice present or you find something dormicey, we can try and advise through that as well. And so our AGM was due in March, and obviously that was cancelled. So we're planning to hold our AGM online on Wednesday the 29th of July at 7 p.m. We're not entirely sure through how that's going to be yet, whether it'll be through Zoom or, but if you email us, get on our mailing list, you can find out about that. We will be sending out some descriptions, but we are looking for more people to join the committee. So if you're interested, get in touch. In particular, admin roles are really essential. So there's a lot of behind the scenes work. It's not all going out and playing in woodlands and getting to cuddle adorable dormice. Yeah, we have a lot of background work, and in particular, we're really keen to get some people involved that are interested in fundraising for us, and yeah, other admin roles as well. So mapping, spreadsheets, anything like that. If you can offer anything like that, do get in touch. I should also mention as well, we've got a Facebook group. It's just Shropshire Dormouse Group. Search that on Facebook, so you can join that as well. We do drop cute pictures in there whenever we monitor, and put updates of events and things in there as well. So thank you very much for joining. I think it's going to be an opportunity to ask questions now. So yeah, I guess we'll see what people have to ask.
Brilliant, thank you for that, Sam. That was perfect.
No worries.
So many lovely photos as well.
Trying to figure out how to stop my screen share. There we go.
There we go, yeah. Right, I've got a long list of questions already, so I'll go straight in so we can get through them all. We had one from Andrew earlier. He was asking what kind of success rate is there in a litter?
So typically speaking, for dormice, they will all survive. So it's not the same as sort of mouse species where they'll have like really big litters because they're, you know, predated on a lot. Generally speaking, within the litter, at least from sort of up to leaving mum, they will survive. It's hibernation really that is the biggest thing, and they're not considered an adult until they survived a hibernation. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. And then we had one from Michelle about litters as well, asking, are there generally more males or females in a litter?
I can't answer that question. I don't know. One of the things that we're hoping to do this year is we have a lot of data, and we tend to produce sort of mini reports, but hopefully by the end of this year we're going to have a big report, and we've now got sort of 5 years worth of data on some sites, so we can start to do some statistical analysis. So maybe that's something that we could look at and include in that report. So if you're interested, get on our mailing list, and then we can send that out and hopefully answer your question then.
Brilliant, thank you. Peter asked, have you ever found a nest made of only moss?
So we often find moss in nest boxes. Most often that will be sort of blue tits and great tits. And wrens as well. So wrens will make massive nests that fill the box with moss. I don't believe, just off the top of my head, that in Shropshire we've ever found dormice in those nests with moss. There are you can see a nest that looks quite dormicey, that's made by bank voles. So sometimes if people get reptile mats and lift them up, you'll see a nest that almost looks like the inner structure of a dormice nest with moss around it. But that'll be bank voles, and it can be quite confusing. That's not to say that dormice won't make them from moss. As I said, they don't read the book, so I'm sure they have made nests from moss.
Well, thank you. We had a question from Eliza asking, is anything known about what conditions lead to higher hibernation mortality?
I don't know. All I know is that there's not masses and masses known about hibernation. I mean, and mainly the fact that it would be what affects most hibernating animals, which would be sort of, fluctuating temperatures, warmer kind of spells where they're brought out of hibernation. I guess that would be linked to kind of choice of hibernation space as well. So if they don't hibernate in an area where the temperature is going to stay pretty constant, they're going to be more likely to be brought out of hibernation. I can't point you towards any specific kind of research on that. On the People's Trust for Endangered Species website, they've got a lot of information about dormice, and also they have a forum. So it's an email forum. You can join that, and there's some absolutely incredible, knowledgeable people on there that share things. So it might be worth popping a question in that and seeing if someone can answer that more specifically.
Well, thank you. We had a question from Rebecca asking, how does the distribution and density of the edible dormice compare?
I mean, I know that the edible dormice is only present in, I think, 2 locations in the country, I believe. I know certainly that the Chilterns are sort of down south. I don't know. I haven't actually looked at how the distributions compare, whether there is, considered to be an impact on the Hazel Dormouse. The edible dormouse is linked to beech, so they eat, I believe mostly what they eat is beech nuts. And dormice, generally speaking, is, as they eat a wide variety of foods, they wouldn't be so hindered by, say, there were edible dormice eating all the beech in an area, because they'll have other food to eat. And similarly, I've had questions about, do grey squirrel impact dormice? And certainly we're aware that grey squirrels can eat things like acorns a lot earlier than other animals would choose to, because they process, I think, the tannins in acorns. But again, I think for the Hazel Dormouse, because they eat a whole variety of foods, I don't think it would have as much of an impact. And the fact that because they live in such low densities, you really will have small numbers in a woodland. I don't think it would have like a major impact, but yeah.
Thank you. Got a question from Amy asking, do you think the decline in the Hazel Dormouse is related to the decline in invertebrates?
Oh, I mean, I can imagine, I would completely understand if there was a link. Like I said, particularly in summer, dormice do rely heavily on invertebrate populations. And as far as I'm aware, if we have wet summers, it can be bad, because I think it knocks all the invertebrates off the trees, and then dormice, you know, for dormice anyway, they can't get them. And I think it's the same for bird species that eat invertebrates. So I could certainly see it having a link, yeah.
Great, thank you. We had a question from Pip, who was asking, do you need a license to carry out the habitat management work?
No, so you've got different levels of licenses. So you've got sort of a survey license, which is what we use for the nest box scheme. And then there are licenses for example, development. Now, if you were going to clear a massive area of woodland, you would absolutely, and you knew dormice were present, you would absolutely need to kind of go down routes, get advice on that. When we're carrying out habitat management, we're doing it very, very small scale. So when I talk about sort of the mosaic of kind of woodland structures that dormice need, it's within a small area. So the home range is sort of a hectare, so they need that within a small area. So you're probably going to have sort of 20-25 metre squared areas that will clear at once. So it's not masses, and that might just include felling 1 or 2 large standard trees. The biggest consideration is probably going to be bats, really, with that sort of thing, rather than licenses for habitat management for dormice. So yeah, and then it's just important to think about sort of nesting birds, really. So you can't do habitat management work while birds are nesting. There's a legal date, I think it's the end of 31st of March, and I can't remember where you can begin again. I think it's 1st September. So just making sure that you do it, you know, not when birds are nesting. There's a lot of considerations for it, but it's not sort of restrictive, you know. It's kind of more, habitat management is beneficial for dormice, and if you don't carry it out, we will lose them. So yeah.
Yeah, and then we've got one from Katie, who's asking, are there any hedgerow species or mixes of species that would be most favourable to dormice?
Yeah, I mean, if you go on the Woodland Trust website, I believe that they often have bundles of kind of native species. So really it's kind of fruiting species, hazel, hawthorn, blackthorn, maple, elder, all the kind of native species that you can think of that are good in a hedgerow. It's important to consider kind of local provenance as well. So for example, on some of our sites, there isn't kind of native blackthorn on that site, so we wouldn't put that in the hedgerow mix. So it's really important to think about that, I think.
Thank you. Sorry, I keep muting myself. I know my laptop's being really noisy. The fan's going on. Sorry for that background noise, everyone. I had a question from Amy asking, how would I find out where locally I could do a nibbled nut survey?
Yeah, I don't know whether you're in Shropshire, or what I was going to mention was, I suppose there's a lot of people on here, you might not all be from Shropshire. So for most people within a geographical range of dormice, you'll have a local dormice group, or if not, a project through a local mammal group. So get in touch with them. I mean, if you are in Shropshire, you could get in touch with us and find out, you know, we could certainly advise you on that. What we're working on at the moment, although we have been working on for a couple of years really, and again we haven't got enough of us doing things, is some sort of system where we have a database and we have a map. So we'll have all the sites that we monitor, and then we'll have all dormice records, and we can start to highlight gaps, so where there are no dormice records, and those will be the places to look for to do a nibbled nut hunt. It is important to note, if you're going to do it, that it would be recommended to seek landowner permission. So if you're doing it along a footpath along the edge of a woodland, you'll probably be okay, but it's not something that you should go out and do without landowner permission. But yeah, certainly get in touch with your local dormice group and we can help advise.
Thank you. We have a question from Gwen asking about your public nest box checks and how you limit disturbance when you're running them.
Sure, yeah. So we absolutely will limit numbers. So when we take out trainees on our nest box checks, we'll only take out sort of 2 or 3. And that is to reduce kind of crowding around a box, and also because we'll be passing around dormice to handle. When we do a public nest box check, we won't pass dormice around. We'll have 1 or 2 of us that are licensed or supporting a licensed person that will do the nest box checks, and then we'll show people. So again, numbers are limited, very small numbers. We won't have people all sort of crowding around a nest box or around a bag if we've taken the nest box off and put it in a bag. And yeah, we just won't pass them around, we'll kind of show them. Obviously the welfare is the most important thing. It is the most important thing when we're monitoring. So we make sure that we process them very, very quickly. as you can see from sort of the pictures of torpor dormice, you can handle them a little bit longer. You know, they're not going to be running around getting distressed, that kind of thing. So yeah, absolutely, welfare is like the biggest consideration.
Thank you. I've got a question from Jeremy here, who's saying, I'd love to see if there are dormice in or and around my small plot of land in Pembrokeshire. If I may put up some dormice boxes and find out there are dormice,
yes,
time form, and do I have to then stop as I need a license?
yes,
or say just start with a nut survey?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'd probably recommend starting with the nut survey first if you've got Hazel, obviously, just because it's less time consuming and less costly, and then you could get a record. You can put up nest boxes and you can check them, but up until, I mean, you're absolutely right, up until the point where you get dormice. So if you get anything that looks like a dormice nest, or you actually see a dormice, at that point you have to stop legally and make sure you have someone come and check them from that point on that's licensed. So it might be worth getting in touch with your local Dormouse group. It might well be that they're offering training, or if you were to do a nibbled nut hunt first and you had solid evidence that they were there, that might mean that your local Dormouse group can, provide support, that kind of thing. But yeah, it can feel a little bit of a restriction. But what I think is quite nice to note is if you put nest boxes up for dormice, and even if you get to the point where you find a nest or a dormice and you're like, oh, I can't check anymore because I'm not licensed. What's really nice to know is that you provided habitat for that dormice. So by putting up a nest box, you potentially increase the carrying capacity because you provide them with nest spaces that they might not otherwise have. So even if you thinking, oh, I can't check them, maybe just sort of like hold on to that, like, well, at least I provided that kind of home for a dormice. So then hopefully in the future you can get trained and go back to checking them as well.
Well, thank you. And then another one about nest boxes as well. Ian was asking, what's the best place to put them in?
The best place to put them. So I don't know whether you mean sort of as in habitat wise or on a very small scale. Yeah, I mean, we put them in woodlands. So we usually what we would do is not put them up until we've done a nut hunt or got a record. So they're costly, time consuming. So your first thing would be to identify the dormice are present. In terms of actually putting them up on trees, usually we put them on a hazel coppice. So we'll try and put them on a stem that's kind of in the middle of a hazel coppice. If you think about kind of predation possibilities, dormice are kind of, because they're quite small, if they're on kind of a big tree sort of up like this and running up it, an owl or something's going to see them much easier. But if you've got a hazel coppice tree like this and you put the box in the middle, they're more likely to use your box because they're going to be covered, protected from sort of predators seeing them, that kind of thing. So that's what we tend to put them on. So yeah, on coppice trees, or maybe a tree that's got sort of dense bramble around it or something. Although bear in mind that when you come to check that in spring, that could be very fun to get to. We also put them at head height as well. So when we check a nest box, I have got one somewhere about, I can't show you on here, but so the lids generally slide. So what we want to do is slide it open very carefully. We've got a duster that we put in the hole at the back and we peek in to see if there's anything in there. So that needs to be at head height. If it's any higher and you can't see it, you could have a dormice escape out of the top. And that can have negative consequences for the dormice. It can also mean that you're not collecting data. And if you put them too low on a tree, they're unlikely to use them really. So yeah, sort of head height, enough covering around it really.
Well, thank you. Priscilla was asking, how do the hazelnut holes differ between animals eating them? What do they look like?
Okay, I made a resource for this. So if you want to send us an email and ask that, I'll send you what I've made. So it's got kind of a close-up view. But the key thing is the way that they actually eat them. So for most for squirrels and birds, they'll peck or crack. For voles and mice, they nibble. They're really messy. But for dormice, they kind of use their teeth a little bit like, if you imagine like an ice cream scoop. So they hold the dormice on the side and they kind of like hold it with their teeth and then twist the nut and it scrapes it out. And that creates this kind of, it's really different, this inner, what the word is, like radial kind of tooth marks. And the tooth marks on the outside are very specific as well. And it's kind of hard to describe without showing you. So yeah, send us an email and I'll send you that resource so you can see it up close.
Well, thank you. We had a question from Jenny asking how widespread are dormice around the world and how are they faring elsewhere?
So the Hazel Dormouse is just in Europe. Yeah, haven't got a map to show you sort of whereabouts in Europe. I don't think they're doing much better than in the UK, to be honest, but it's really difficult to know. The UK is the only place that has this national dormice monitoring programme. So as far as I'm aware, there are no other European countries that have that. So we know that they're endangered, but there's no actual data to kind of tell us what's happening, which is why, why it's actually really amazing that we've got that programme here in the UK and that it's been going for 30 years, because we know that they're declining, so we can do something about it. What I do know is there's a woman called Hurdler, and she carries out some absolutely incredible research on dormice. She's in Belgium, so look her up, although I can't remember how to spell her name. I think it's Goedele, and she's looked into all sorts of dormice, sort of the way they use habitat. She's radio tracked them and built these wonderful feeding platforms and all sorts. So it's not strictly about their distribution in Europe, but absolutely fascinating stuff. So recommend going and checking that out.
Well, thank you. We had a question from Lawrence. He said, thank you for the talk. What did you say the mortality rate was for during hibernation?
Yeah, it's between 40 and 70%. So that stat was probably from a few years ago now. So I don't know if there's an updated stat in reference to how climate change is impacting them yet. Maybe that's a project for someone.
Oh, thank you. We've got a couple of questions about people asking for how to find their local dormouse groups. Is there a page they can go to where they're all listed, or?
No, there's not a page. What I would do is simply just sort of Google your county and the Dormouse Group. So generally speaking, it'll be called, like ours is Shropshire Dormouse Group. It'll be, Surrey Dormouse Group or whatever. Yeah, and if you can't find that, contact your local mammal group. So again, I think nearly every county has a local mammal group. Again, if you Google your county plus mammal group, you'll be able to find them. Just send them an email. They'll be able to point you in the right direction. I know for some local mammal groups, they don't have a dormice group. They just have a sort of project that's aimed at dormice. So yeah, they'll be the best people to ask.
Yeah, thank you. I'm conscious of time. I'm trying to get through all the questions. Bear with me. We've got one from Miriam here asking, are there specific times of year that are preferred for having a litter, for example, specific months, or do they have as evenly from spring to autumn?
So it will probably vary a little bit dependent on temperature, but generally speaking, I know for us in Shropshire, they would usually only have one litter, and it would be August, September. And we'd usually see loads and loads of dormice in October. For sort of places where they'll have 2 litters a year, they'll generally have one in sort of June, and then they'll have the later one as well. But I said that probably will vary a little bit depending on, I guess, what the winter's been like, how that's impacted hibernation, when they come out of hibernation, how much food there is, whether they can put on enough fat to be in sort of breeding condition to be able to breed. Yes, there'll be a lot of factors like that, really.
That's great, thank you. I saw a question before, although I've lost it now, but it was basically asking, can you use cameras to monitor nest boxes? So you wouldn't need a license then, you could just check a video camera.
Yeah, so this is something that we've been looking at. We've got one of our volunteers who is kind of working on something and has been recording a nest box. So you don't need a license to do it, but it's really important to consider impact. So for example, something that we put in place with this was that the camera on the nest box, the SD card and batteries and things could only be checked when we were doing a nest box check anyway. Because if you're putting it on a nest box, you're probably knowing that there's a nest in there, and then by getting the camera, if it's really close, there's a lot of sound, and so just to be careful, really. It would be trying to be sensible about that. Not going every day to check your camera and to change your SD card, that kind of thing. Yeah, that would probably be the best thing to do, or try and make sure it's a distance away, like quite a bit away, although they're a small animal, so might not get the best footage, but yeah.
Well, thank you. I'm going to try and squeeze one more question in the last minute. We've had a question from G Pound, just asking, how much does it cost to obtain Dormouse handling license, and how long are the courses to get a license?
Sure. So in terms of cost, I mean, that can vary a lot. Mainly it's time costly. So if you're really, really lucky and you live in a county where they've got millions of dormice and your Dormouse group can take you out every month on lots of reserves, you might get enough physical experience within a year. For some people, it might take longer. It really depends on opportunities. Obviously, you can never promise that there's going to be enough dormice. So that you need to be able to handle all life stages. So of course, if you only get to handle one box of kind of greys eyes open, that's not going to be enough really to be competent. So it's more time costly. In terms of the courses, so I'm trying to think how much we were charging for ours. We were much cheaper, but the Mammal Society will do them, but they are, I think I paid about £100 for a day course. It really varies. So I'm trying to think, I think we did about £50–60 for our 2-day course. And I said with the Stepping Stones project, we're hoping to be able to put those courses on again. It might well be that we can kind of subsidise the cost of tickets as well with that. Yeah, it really depends where you are, to be honest. Yeah.
No, brilliant. Thank you very much. So yeah, big thank you for joining us today, Sam. It's been a great presentation, very interesting, lots of information as well. And I could see someone in the chat has posted a link to a resource for the nuts, like you were saying before. So I'll send that around in the email as well for everyone.
Sure.
And yeah, thank you for joining us, and thank you everyone else for coming along today as well and joining us. Hope you enjoyed it. And as I said, I'll send around all that follow-up information in an email sometime over the next couple of days, and I'll get this recording uploaded to YouTube as soon as I can as well, so you can rewatch it at a later date. So yeah, hopefully we'll see you all soon. Bye.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.